good. Alhamdulillah. So, Dr. Ware, if you have any questions as we're going or whatever, feel free to reach out to just say the tech people, just yell Malcolm or Mimi or something like that. Everything we do in here uh, easy go lucky.
Got you. And I can see the chat too, so we should be cool in the Q&A.
Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Rashida. MashaAllah, it's good to see you. Allahu Akbar. Folks, as you're joining, may Allah reward you for coming in. We'll just be waiting a few minutes before we get started on our the fourth session of our Ramadan series, Islam and Social Justice. I need to make sure I give a shout out to our tech folks before I forget at the end. Brother Malcolm, mashallah, is joining us and has been joining us, and Sister Mimi, one of our main pillars of the community, is also here, alhamdulillah. So welcome everybody, and let's make sure we make an extra dua for our brothers and sisters that's helping make the magic happen. And I was, as I was telling Dr. Ware earlier, I said, I have not forced anybody to be here. Allahu Akbar. So Sheikh, just quick introduction. And Khadija, I can't see you. My screen's tripping a little bit. I'm not sure if Sister Khadija, yes, Allahu Akbar, you there. So welcome, Dr. Ware. As you know, this is a series that we've been doing starting in Ramadan. And I didn't realize until yesterday, it was in part inspired by a program that they used to have in Los Angeles called the Brother to Brother Breakfast, where a lot of the elders in Los Angeles would do a breakfast after Fajr. Just get together, break bread, and be around Muslims and listen to the word of Allah as a form of encouragement. And so ever since then, I've kind of really enjoyed doing programs after Fajr. And this was an opportunity to not only do a program after Fajr, but open it up to anybody who wanted to log in. So may Allah reward you for joining us. We're all really excited to have you today. I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, Khadija, to introduce herself, say a few words, and then we'll get started.
Cool.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Khadija. I am the Advocacy Initiative Director for Amnesty West, and I will be your co-host facilitator today. And I'm really excited to do this, inshallah. Just any questions you have there.
Yes, and overall boss in a good sense. I realize bosses probably do deserve a bad rap, but she is a force to be reckoned with within our community, and blessed to have her co-facilitating. So with all of that being said, Dr. Ware, we're going to go ahead and hand it off to you, and then we'll have a question and answer following the lecture.
Excellent. So assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Greetings, peace and blessings of God Most High to everybody that's assembled. As I reflected on what the appropriate topic to contribute to this series was going to be, I wanted to frame a presentation that would give us some historical context for contemporary struggles for abolition, for police reconstitution / abolition / reimagining, by telling a story about some African Muslim genealogies of abolition and freedom struggles, which may not be known to folks in this room. These are African freedom struggles that actually go back to the continent. And some of the stories that you're going to hear this morning can be found in my first book, The Walking Quran, chapter 3 of that book. But the subtitle of the book is Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge and History in West Africa. It's a history of 1,000 years of Islamic knowledge transmission in West Africa and the way that it's related to social change, social struggle, and social justice work. So the third chapter of that book is called The Book in Chains, and it's about African Muslim struggles against the slave trade at the height of the slave trade. So part of what I'm going to talk about this morning is drawn from that first work. And then other material is from a book that's not finished that really does a deep dive on this one particular revolutionary movement in the Senegal River Valley at the end of the 18th century that leads to the first modern republic to abolish the institution of slavery within it. So you're going to hear a story about genealogies of liberation that's going to be quite different from some of the stories that you're used to hearing on that topic. So without any further ado, let's just go ahead and hop right into it. And just give me a heads up or a nod in the chat if you're getting that in full screen. Let me just pull up the chat so I can actually see that. Perfect. Okay, so we're calling this the First Atlantic Revolution, Islam, Abolition, and Republic, 1770 to 1806. And we're going to start just by framing, as I mentioned before, that part of this argument comes out of the third chapter of my first book, The Walking Quran. The title is here, and the rest of the talk is from a work in progress, which is about this revolution in the Senegal River Valley. So I'm gonna start with a quotation. And I'll just set it up a little bit. This is from a text from the 1840s, written here in the good old United States of America by a white evangelical preacher. The title of the book is Pro-Slavery Interpretations of the Bible That Are Productive of Infidelity. He, being a kind of progressive in his time, made the argument in this work in the 1840s that proselytizing to enslaved Africans by telling them that they could serve white masters one day in heaven the same way that they served them on earth was unlikely to produce lots of converts. So he gathered up stories about how pro-slavery interpretations of the Bible were actually hindering the spread of Christianity. And in that, he gives this account of an enslaved Muslim man at the port of Savannah in the year 1806. So I'll just read it. In the year 1806, on the arrival of a slaver from the coast of Africa, John Doherty went to the city of Savannah to buy slaves. After several hundred had been sold in lots and single as suited the purchasers, a middle-aged man was put upon the stand who wished to make a communication before he was sold, the purport of which was that he was a Mohammedan, and that whenever the hour of prayer and other devotional duties came, he must have time to attend to them. Mr. D, who had lately embraced religion and seemed to be zealous to promote the cause, gave the highest price for him, feeling confident within himself that he would convert him to the true faith. Taking him to his plantation, he built him a hut and assured him that he should be allowed the time he required, and in addition should have every opportunity to attend all the meetings of the Christians. The Mohammedan slave for a while attended these meetings and learned something of Christianity without, however, discontinuing his former devotions. At the expiration of about a year, his master, who was intent on his conversion, asked him formally if he did not prefer Christianity to Mohammedanism and if he would not openly renounce the prophet and acknowledge Jesus Christ. The slave asked if the Christian religion allowed one Christian to hold another in slavery and their children after them. The answer, of course, was in the affirmative. The Mohammedan replied that the religion of the prophet did not allow that. The result of all was this slave, in a land of Bibles and gospel ministers, daily said his prayers, performed ablutions, made his prostrations, and at an advanced age died, declaring that God was one God and Muhammad was his prophet. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this story related from the early part of the 19th century actually encodes an incredibly detailed historical narrative behind it. Because as many of you may know, the ordinary position of most Muslim scholars, especially those of Arab background in North Africa and East Africa, held the opinion that, of course, indeed, Muslims could own other Muslims and their children after them. Yet here you have an African man saying that the religion of the Prophet does not allow that. In fact, in some contemporary Arab Muslim societies like Mauritania, for example, they just had to abolish the institution of slavery legally just a few decades ago. We have, places in North Africa where Africans are being traded as currency today. So this idea, and of course, we know the abominations of the so-called Islamic State, they were engaging in practices of slave trade as well. So where is this African Muslim man coming from? That in 1806, he says, no, God, the law of God as taught by the Prophet Muhammad does not allow believing people to own one another and their children after them in perpetuity. I'm going to tell the story of how he arrived at that dock. But I want you to just keep in mind that we are seeking out our own genealogies as abolitionists in the story that I'm about to tell you this morning. So let me go back to the sharing the screen. So the first thing that I'll say is that, as I mentioned in my first book, as I mentioned, my first book is about Islamic knowledge transmission. It's about institutions of schooling in West Africa primarily. The first thing to understand about many of those enslaved African Muslims that were brought to different parts of the New World, including what becomes the United States of America, is that many were literate. At least 10%, probably 15% of the total volume of the Atlantic slave trade, those 13 to 20 million enslaved Africans that were brought to the New World, were of Muslim background, which makes Muslims the largest single identity group, larger than any individual African ethnic group involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And part of what's distinctive about that community is that this was a highly literate community. Senegalese historian Boubacar Bari points out that in the 17th and 18th century, literacy rates in the Senegambia region, which basically encompasses the modern nations of Senegal, Gambia, Mali, Guinea, that literacy rates in those regions were much higher at that point in time than they were anywhere in Europe. And they were also coeducational forms of education. Girls have always been an important contingent in West African Quran schools. And it's likely that in the 18th century, something like 60% of all males and probably about 30% of all females in the Senegal River Valley region have literacy skills in Arabic and or African languages using the Arabic script. And one of the things that we're going to see time and time again is that the traces of those literacy practices in West Africa actually show up in resistance to enslavement here in the New World. For example, in the 1830s in Salvador de Bahia in Brazil, the largest urban slave rebellion in the history of the West is organized through written practices by enslaved, mostly Yoruba and Hausa Muslims from what's now northern Nigeria. They plan and plot their entire slave rebellion by writing letters to one another in Arabic and also in Hausa and Yoruba using the Arabic script. And we down to the present have surviving traces of their not only their writing to plan, but also their talismans for protection. And I just want to point out that this was co-educational, another distinction between ordinary modalities of knowledge transmission in predominantly Arab Muslim communities and those that obtain amongst Africans. You can see this kind of knowledge transmission right down to the present in the Senegal River Valley, which is, as you'll see, in all likelihood, the region that man on that Savannah dock was coming from in 1806. And you can still see the Quran being taught to children on the same wooden boards that were used to teach the Quran to children in the Prophet's own community in the city of Medina 1400 years ago. West Africa is actually one of the few places where you can still see this as the basic means of teaching basic literacy skills to children, not just to read and write the Arabic language, not just to learn recitation of the Quran, but as you can see on this tablet, voweling lessons often given, which allow you to write any African language using the Arabic script, the same way that we write the English language using the Latin script. There is no English alphabet. You'll see these tablets continued literally like the first tablets, right? Before iPads and Samsungs, this is what a tablet was, because it's an easily erasable surface, which is excellent for drafting, poetry and other kinds of texts without having to use paper, easily washable and erasable. And right down to the present, you can see traditional knowledge transmission of the advanced religious sciences taught in the Senegal River Valley, the same way that they were taught 200 years ago, or 250 years ago, most likely, when that Savannah man was being taught the religion of Islam, or 1,000 years before that, when the first Fulani and Wolof and Serer teachers began teaching the Quran in the region. So a lot that I could say about that. I'll say a couple of things about my first book. The argument of the book is depicted on the cover, that traditional knowledge transmission in Islamic Africa is not something that works strictly through the transmission of analytical reason, the way that Western education does. Rather, the goal is to transmit knowledge as an embodied lived reality from one agent to another, from adults to children, an argument which is depicted visually on the cover. But another part of the argument of the book is that we need to pay attention to Africa when thinking about the history of Islam. Africa is the only continent in the world that has a Muslim majority. There are more than 350 million Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa, Black Africa, as it is still sometimes called. 1 in 6 of the world's Muslims lives in sub-Saharan Africa. 27% of the world's total Muslim population lives on the African continent. And there are far more Black Muslims, sub-Saharan Muslims, than North African Muslims. There are more Muslims in Nigeria than there are in Egypt. There are more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq. So when we start to think about genealogies of Black struggle expressed through Islam, we need to be thinking about not just our history of struggle here. And I am rocking the Malcolm shirt this morning, but also as Malcolm, Brother El-Haj Malik Shabazz put it, he said, a cat, if a cat has kittens in an oven, you don't call them biscuits. Now, what did he mean by that? He said, show me Negro land on a map. You call yourself a Negro, well, show me Negro land. He said, I don't know where Negro land is, but I can show you Africa. If a cat has kittens in an oven, you don't call them biscuits. If Africans have descendants and offsprings and progeny in the New World, call them Africans. So we need to connect ourselves to this legacy, not just because of some of our biological origins and some of our genealogical origins in the history of the struggle, but because there are practical examples about how you struggle against the fundamental evils of the age that can be studied in the African Islamic tradition. So that's one way of explaining kind of the basic argument of the book, or one image for it. And here's another, right? That the primordial role for Black people in this religion, and we've been in it from the beginning, is to call people to the reality of the faith. And the reality of the faith is the ascension of the socially marginalized to the highest and loftiest of positions, through a religion that acknowledges no nobility or distinction, except that through reverence of God. And that reverence of God is established through two things in the Quran. It is established through adl and through afu, through justice, establishing justice first, and then pardoning a portion of one's rights in order to establish peace, but no peace before the establishment of justice. And much more could be said about that, but I won't go into it. So as I mentioned, Just in the interest of time, I won't go into it. As I mentioned, part of the argument that I'm going to give you this morning is from chapter 3 of the Walking Quran, and that chapter is called "The Book and Chain: Slavery and Revolution in Senegambia from 1770 to 1890." We're going to be focused on the period that ends with 1806 in today's lecture, but every single chapter of the book is framed by a saying, a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the saying that governs this particular chapter is, whoever frees a believing slave, God will free his every limb from the fire, just as he has freed those of the slave. And I want you to keep that in mind. So the first thing that I'll say is that resistance to the enslavement of Muslims and resistance to the slave trade itself was focused in the West African region. And I'll just stop the share for a moment to kind of explain this face to face. What tended to galvanize societal resistance to this travesty of the age was the enslavement of religious scholars, teachers, male and female, like the sheikh that you saw in the image, surrounded by his students of the advanced sciences. When I started to research what was taking place in the Senegal region, broader Senegambia, from the 1500s, and indeed the resistance to the slave trade starts there in the 1500s, is I noticed that it tended to be sparked not just by the violation of Islamic law, because Muslims are never supposed to enslave other Muslims. Even if in some interpretations of Islamic law, Muslims are allowed to own other people of belief, they're never allowed to enslave free Muslims. So what was taking place with European funding, European arms trading, was that African rulers were being turned, as one observer in the age talked about it, from wolves into shepherds amongst their people, through Europeans essentially starving and murdering the shepherds and feeding the wolves, until you had African rulers who were willing to trade prisoners of war, captives, and then later sometimes their own citizens, their own peasants, in exchange for bottles of rum, in exchange for firearms and ammunition, and in exchange for cloth and clothing, which was used to maintain a following. So clerical communities, scholars, religious scholars who had previously been pacifists in this period with the rise of the Atlantic slave trade actually start to organize armed military resistance to these slave trading regimes. And that becomes especially pronounced in the 1760s and 1770s with increasingly flagrant enslavement of not just ordinary peasants, but religious scholars. And if you just think about that picture on the cover of the Walking Quran, the idea being depicted is that to know Islam is to embody it, to be the Quran walking upon the earth, the same way that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was described by his wife Aisha as the Quran walking upon the earth. Well, just think about, if you're thinking about people that memorize the Quran and teach it and are responsible for the transmission of Islamic knowledge through this society as being kind of physical exemplars of the book, then imagine the outrage at the desecration, not only of the Quran, but of their fundamental humanity through a series of tragic incidences of the enslavement of clerics themselves, of religious scholars. Imagine somebody marching into the Vatican, pulling out the Pope and putting him at the bottom of a slave ship, and how Catholics might respond to that. And you can get a sense of how Senegambian society is going to respond to the enslavement of clerics over the course of time. So I'll go back to the slides to get through the material in a timely fashion. From within the approach to knowledge within traditional Islam, enslavement of religious scholars is not just a violation of the law, but it's a desecration of the book of God itself. And this is something that's being carried out both by the armed retainers of African kings, and also by especially Mauritanian and Moorish slavers who are raiding the Senegal River Valley for captives. And also, in most instances, it should be noted, selling them not to North Africa, not to Morocco, but actually selling them directly to the English or to the French. And that's also another crucial thing to understand, when I actually got into the research of this, is that much of the so-called Arab slave trade in its early foundations is not at all something that emerges from the Islamic world. It's something that actually grows right out of the Atlantic slave trade, with Arab populations becoming connected to the European trade in African slaves, and then ultimately coming to use enslaved labor much more prominently within their own societies, and also increasingly racializing it. Slavery becomes something that is only visited on Black people as time goes on. I can't get into too much more detail about that just in the interest of time, but I want to give you another quote to reflect on, with respect to how to understand the movement for liberation in the Senegal River Valley. And this passage that I'm about to read, and this is a crucial part, I want people to have their attention highly trained on this. The passage I'm about to read is from a book by the Reverend Thomas Clarkson. The Reverend Thomas Clarkson is, in many senses, the founder of modern Western abolitionism. He is, for example, the tutor of William Wilberforce, who is usually identified as the father of abolitionism in England. But in fact, he learned abolitionism from Thomas Clarkson. Thomas Clarkson was the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, upon which many North American abolitionist organizations, at least white abolitionist organizations, were modeled, I should say. Not only that, he's also one of the founding members of La Société des Amis des Noirs, the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, which is the first modern French abolitionist organization. So in many respects, you're about to hear from the founder of European abolitionism. And what's interesting about what he says is that he attributes the foundations of abolitionism to African Muslims in the Senegal River Valley in his very first work on the subject, which is called Letters on the Slave Trade. So he talks about, in about a quarter of this first work, he narrates the story of the anti-slavery revolution in the Senegal River Valley, because he's interviewed slave ship captains and other people who have returned to Europe from the Senegal region. And he talks about the leader of this movement, Almami Abdul Qadir Khan. And Almami is just the Fulani rendering of El Imam, the leader. Because part of what's taking place, interestingly, in this revolution is that not only is slavery being abolished, but monarchy is also being abolished. He is not a king, rather he is an imam of a representative democracy, one of the world's first republics. So here's what Clarkson says. To the sovereigns of Europe, the wise and virtuous imam sets an illustrious example in extirpating the commerce in the human race. And when we consider this amiable man as having been trained up in a land of slavery, and having had in the introduction of such a revolution all the prejudices of education and custom to oppose, when we consider him again as sacrificing part of his own revenue, refusing the presence of Europeans, and exposing himself in consequence of it to the vindictive ravages of the agents of the latter, he is certainly more to be respected than any of the sovereigns of Europe, inasmuch as he has made a much nobler sacrifice than they, and has done more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion. Anglican priest, founder of European abolitionism, crediting an African Muslim ruler, really governor, because he's not a king, for doing what doing in practice and in action what European governments had not had the courage to even really reflect on publicly. And I just want you to let that sink in for a moment as we reflect on how the story of abolitionism has been narrated to us, as though it emerged fully formed like Athena from the waves, like emerging from the Greek tradition, and the European traditions of Enlightenment rationalism to grant freedom and humanity to all. Here's the society, the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, crediting African Muslims for the foundation of abolitionism. Not satisfied with these proceedings, he made a decree as a discouragement to the slave trade in the beginning of the year 1787, that whereas slaves made in other distant countries had been accustomed to be passed in their way to Fort St. Louis, that's Saint Louis in modern Senegal, through his dominions, no such passage should be allowed them in the future, and accordingly at the proper season of the year, he put his decree into execution by stopping the passage of slaves. They tried him next by many and rich presents, but he sent them all back, adding that he would not only hinder the route of slaves for that year, but as long as he should live, and that if the whites should attempt any depredations on his subjects in consequence of his determination, he would retaliate. His next step was to prohibit the sale of the persons of men and to abolish personal slavery in his own dominions, giving encouragement to agriculture and manufactures in their place. So in the only mistake that Clarkson makes in his narration of this incident is that the decree that he assigns to 1787, because this is when one of his main sources tells him about this decree, is actually something that's dated to 1776. That's when Khan first makes this proclamation that not only is he freeing any person of slave background in Futa Toro who can recite a single ayah of the Quran, a single verse of the Quran, but he's also prohibiting the passage of any enslaved people through his territories to be traded with Europeans or with anyone. And it's a really crucial distinction because Khan in the oral tradition is represented as having said the Muslim that should be protected from the indignities of enslavement is the one that says La ilaha illallah, even if he pronounces it Ra iraha irra. In other words, he doesn't care what your actual religious identification or vocation is. His understanding of the Quran is that not a single verse of God's word should be held in bondage, much less an integral copy of the Quran. So that reciting a single ayah of the Quran, and I'll remind you that single verses of the Quran are sometimes comprised of a single letter, right? Qaf is an ayah. So that should set a human being free. So he is using an expansive understanding of the premise in Islamic law that Muslims shouldn't enslave other Muslims, and he's offering freedom to anybody who will make a formal profession of Islam, whatever their reasoning or whatever their the condition of their hearts may happen to be. So it's an extraordinary emancipation proclamation that Abdul Qadir Khan offers in 1776. There's much I could say about the effects that has in the Senegal River Valley, and I can take that on Q&A. But essentially, it starts to depopulate surrounding regions because people are tired of the abuses of enslaving kings and throw their weight behind this revolutionary movement that is about freedom, and not just freedom from slavery, but also freedom from monarchy as an inherently oppressive institution. And we're fighting, Americans are fighting the same struggle in 1776 against monarchy, but we obviously sold out on the liberty from enslavement part with our whole 3/5 of a person compromise. And again, we can talk about that in the Q&A. Just want to point out that this is not, what's interesting is in spite of the fact that I'm the first historian to really write about this in 40 years and the first to write about it in any kind of detail, is that this was not like a hidden story at the end of the 18th century. You don't have a region of extensive slave supply for the slave trade drop out of it entirely and it not leave a mark in the records at the time. So the first, one of the first governors of Senegal in 1829, Baron Roger, who was resident in Senegal as a young man, when Abdul Qadir Khan made his Emancipation Proclamation, points this out. He said, just in passing, he declared that no free fool of man could ever more be reduced to captivity, that trade would introduce no new slaves into the country, and that every former slave who could read a passage from the Quran would immediately gain his freedom. The only mistake in Roger's narration is that it wasn't a slave who could read a passage from the Quran, it was anybody that could recite one. The last British governor of Senegal, before it goes back into the hands of the French, basically really right down to the present, Lieutenant Governor Maxwell, after the British abolition of the slave trade in 1807, notes, just in passing in some documents, it may be here necessary to remark that there's been greater facility in negotiating with the Imam and less probability of again having disputes with him in consequence of the abolition of the slave trade, a commerce which that prince always opposed as being contrary to the laws of his religion and the means through which several of his subjects, followers of the Prophet, were led into captivity. Much more could be said about this, but I'm going to start to wrap up in the interest of time. And I just want to move through this. I'm not going to go through the chronology of the revolution, but I want to just talk about some of the after effects of the revolution. This revolution in the Senegal River Valley is the first large-scale anti-slavery movement in 100 years. There's another one like it in the 1670s, actually. But this one in the 1770s is much more successful. It essentially abolishes the institution of slavery in a massive region, the northern part of the Senegambia region, for a span of 36 years until Abdul Qadir Khan is assassinated in 1806. And it's very likely that that man at that Savannah dock is one of the lieutenants that is enslaved in the battles that lead to Khan's being deposed as the ruler of Futa Toro. The empire strikes back, and the slave trade is, in point of fact, reestablished after a 36-year absence from the region. Having said that, that movement leads to the spread of other anti-slavery movements, including the revolution of Uthman Dan Fodio in northern Nigeria, which is driven in large part by exactly the same dynamics that were taking place in the Senegal River Valley. And this is a part of that is usually misunderstood about Dan Fodio's movement, is that his so-called jihad isn't a struggle against disbelievers for the sake of them being disbelievers. It's often narrated in that way by kind of overly militant understandings of Islam. His revolution, and the sources from the time of this are clear, is to stop the enslavement of Muslims by Muslims, the exact same thing that's taking place in the Senegal River Valley. And indeed, he's doing this a generation after Khan sets the example. And across 19th century West Africa, there are a series of revolutionary movements that follow in the footsteps of Abdul Qadir Khan that are essentially waves of emancipation. Those waves of emancipation, however, do not just remain confined. Oh, and if you want to know more about this, sorry about that. Let me get back into the slideshow and we'll just do this way. Watch episode 5 of Africa's Great Civilizations, and I talked in great detail about Uthman Dan Fodio's movement. I can't give it justice in this context, but the thing that I want to say is that the waves of that revolution don't just wash up or don't just spread through the African continent, they also wash up on American shores. Just like that man in 1806 in Savannah, we have evidence of, and I'm writing about this in my current work, about enslaved lieutenants of Abdul Qadir Khan literally getting off of slave ships at being sold in Antigua, and then 6 months later fomenting slave rebellions there. There's a documented instance of a person who fought against the slave trade alongside Abdul Qadir Khan in a famous battle in 1796. He gets enslaved when Khan's party loses that battle, and he is sold into slavery, first arriving in Cuba, then later ending up in Saint-Domingue, where he fights alongside Toussaint Louverture to end slavery in Haiti. So this revolution, may not have been televised, but it was known and it was spreading through slave barracks and through the parlors of white abolitionists in Paris and in London. The driving engine for freedom in the Atlantic age is African Muslims, if you only knew. And we still have evidence of their profound work, because in addition to that Savannah man who's unnamed, we have reference to numerous Bilalis that come from the broader Senegambia region that are showing up in South Carolina and Georgia sources at the very end of the international slave trade. The period between 1780 and 1807 is a time when many, many Muslims are arriving in my father's home state of Georgia. Amongst them are numerous Baileys that are found in the Sea Island registers. This is a commonly taken name amongst formerly enslaved Africans in the region. What's striking about the Baileys is that there are no white Baileys in the Sea Islands. And it's very likely that the name Bailey, when it's taken by Sea Islands Black folks, is actually an anglicization of the name Bilali. The most famous Bilali, the most famous Bailey, is Frederick Douglass, who, as we know, his father was a white man, most likely his owner, or perhaps another white man from another plantation, but his maternal lineage are Baileys from the Sea Islands. So America's most famous abolitionist, African America's most famous abolitionist, is likely descended from West Africa's most famous abolitionist. And I'll just read to close this about how this is our birthright and our natural inheritance as Black Muslims. This is from a WPA slave narrative from the 1930s. This is the last generation to have witnessed the institution of slavery being interviewed about the religious practices of their forefathers. I'm looking for my prayer beads just to have the appropriate prop for the passage, but in one of these narratives, and there are many narratives about the practice of Islam amongst the formerly enslaved, they used to say that Bilali and his wife Phoebe pray on the bead. They was very particular about the time they pray, and they very regular about the hour. When the sun come up, when it's straight overhead, and when it's set, that's the time they pray. They bow to the sun and have a little mat to kneel on. The beads is on a long string. Bilali, he pull a bead and he say, Balambi Hakabara Muhammadu. Phoebe, she say, Amen, Amen. And what we have here depicted is actually one of the surviving documents written by an enslaved African in the Sea Islands. It's an effort to write out from memory the Risala of Qayrawani, one of the Islamic legal texts that is used to establish the basic rites and rituals of practice. So I want to just highlight that right down to the 1930s, the practice of Islam amongst the enslaved was within reach of living memory, at the same time that you have the establishment of Sunni Islamic practice in cities like Detroit and Islamic institutions like the Moorish Science Temple and the early beginnings of the Nation of Islam taking place in cities. When people tell you that Islam died out and then is reestablished, they're making a claim that they cannot demonstrate. Arguments from silence about Black people's history in this country are exceedingly dangerous because I can tell you this, if I was being interviewed about the religious practices of my ancestors and they were Muslims by some white person that's showing up on my front porch in Georgia in the 1930s, I'm not telling them that I'm Muslim. And I'm not convinced that the description of people praying on the bead back in the day isn't masking references to people praying on that bead right that very moment as soon as those researchers leave the front porch. So I'll end the presentation with that so that we can get right into questions.
MashaAllah, Jazakumullah khair, Sheikh. May Allah reward you. You know, it's listening to you talk about this history that's, you know, by and large been ignored is always super informative to me. I actually hadn't heard about Bailey being a derivative of Bilali before. And, you know, I teach Douglass in a number of my classes as well. So having said that, I'm going to hand it over to Sister Khadija. I think she has a question to ask. And folks in the audience, if you have questions, right now, mashallah, Sister Yasmin has quite a few. But if you have questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A, inshallah, and Allah willing, we'll be able to get to those as well. Sister Khadija.
Awesome. Jazakallah khair. So my question is, how can we revive the history of abolition within our Muslim communities here in the United States when the states have been so engraved and sustain white supremacy?
Yeah, so it is the question of the hour, right? And I made an Instagram post about this last summer when I was trying to kind of educate the broader community about elements of this history, pointing them to YouTube talks and such where I've talked about it. And I just made a simple claim. I said, if we do not situate ourselves in the genealogies of our African Muslim abolitionist forefathers and understand that police violence and the carceral state, which robs people of color of their freedom, are the direct descendants of the institutions that they struggled against, then we are traitors to our own ancestral legacy and to our religion, right? Because you can draw a direct and straight line from 3/5 of a person to depriving convicts of voting rights, right? The idea inherent in both is that you want to count people for population purposes and the allocation of federal resources, but you don't want them to be able to vote. You want to be able to take away their freedom, count them for getting resources, and in fact, privatize them so that they can become profit-producing entities. And what I tell my students at UCSB, I say, listen, the way that you guys now think about slavery and the slave trade in that time, that's how historians are going to write about the prison industrial complex and the carceral state in 100 years. They're going to ask, what kind of people were they that they just let this happen and didn't do anything about it, right? And when I ask it in that way of my students in class, and they immediately recognize, yeah, that's how it's going to be written about in 100 years. When I talk about this to Muslim communities, forget the judgment of history in 100 years. What about the judgment of God? How are we going to stand before our Lord when people are being systematically deprived of their liberty and murdered in the streets simply because they are Black and brown and poor? This is not a social justice issue. And that is not how Abdul Qadir Khan saw it either, right? He didn't see it as a simple secular social struggle issue. He saw it as whoever frees a believing person, God will free their every limb from the fire, just as he has freed those of the enslaved person. And for him, a person with belief was a person who was willing to utter La ilaha illallah, even if they ain't say it right. So the point is it's not just about protecting people that we believe are part of our religious community, but it's about extending the ethical and moral imperatives that are foundational in our religion to shield human beings from injustice and oppression. And that's a struggle that Black Muslims have actually been at the forefront. Like if in a longer version of the presentation, and I can give this as part answer to Yasmin's question, right? When the Arab slave trade really starts to take off, and it doesn't start, an Arab trade in Africans does not have a significant numerical, what's the word I'm looking for? Substance until the Atlantic slave trade is underway. It is an offshoot of the growth of the Atlantic slave trade. It's one of the most common misconceptions about it. But when that happens in the 1500s, the first scholars to talk about this are scholars in Timbuktu, right? Both Black and Arab descended scholars are writing against this injustice. African scholars are immediately at the forefront of this. You have Moroccan jurists when Moroccan rulers try to enslave people just because they're Black in both the 17th and 18th century. You have Muslim scholars literally being murdered by the state, executed for their refusal to rubber stamp this basic violation of human dignity. So there's a long tradition of abolitionist struggle within African Muslim society specifically, especially in West Africa, but also in North Africa, in point of fact. And we have almost no knowledge, right, of the fact that African Muslims have been at the forefront of struggling against the foundational form of oppression of the age. And you asked a short and simple question. I'm gonna give you a long and complicated answer, but I'm gonna add one more piece to it. White supremacy, as we know it, and racial capitalism, as we know it, are both founded in the Atlantic slave trade. All of our modern commercial institutions, the first corporations, the first companies are slave trading companies. Sylvester Johnson has written about this. Many historians have written about this. So the foundational evils of our age, white supremacy and racial capitalism, are literally produced on our bodies, right? Defining the entire institutional ethos of our current age for the last 500 years. African Muslim scholars immediately recognized this evil and started struggling against it. And we are descendants of them. So how could we refuse to take up the call?
Subhanallah. Why I feel like there's always a mic drop at the end of your responses, man. It's like, dang, how are we gonna ask a question? So we have some really good questions in the Q&A, but I'm gonna take advantage of my position as one of the hosts, kind of following up on what you said right now. So in some of my classes, when I talk about slavery, inevitably there's somebody in the class that makes the case, and racism, frankly, that
Yep.
make the case, well, hasn't racism always been there, or hasn't slavery always been there? One of the things that becomes very apparent in a lot of our Islamic discourse or discourse amongst Muslims is the way that Western worldviews have played away in the way that we see the world and interpret what we're reading, what we're talking about, and the words that we use. So for example, many people will make the case that Islam is oppressive against women because women sit in the back of are in the back of the masjid, turning kind of this Islamic discussion viewing it from the eyes of somebody sitting in the back of the bus, right? And so how can it not be oppression if it doesn't closely resemble what we see here? And in the same way, I think a lot of the time our conversations around slavery, but even race, right? What it means to be black, what it doesn't mean to be black, what it means, what's an Arab in Africa, what's a non-Arab, what's a black person in Africa? Can you talk a little bit about, or even abolition, right? And talking about getting rid of police or getting rid, all of those concepts are so kind of linked to the way we've been raised. It's not our fault necessarily, right? It's what we've watched on TV, what we've read in our books, et cetera, the way that we see the world. Can you talk a little bit about how viewing these conversations from that lens ends up really robbing us from a kind of broader, larger conversation?
Yeah, so the thing that to help pull together the different parts of what you asked, two people were echoing in my head. One was Malcolm, and Malcolm is saying, of all the disciplines, history is the most likely to bear fruit for the struggle, right? And then Ibn Khaldun, really the founder of the modern discipline of history, 14th century North African sociologist and historian, thinking of history as this tool in this way. And between the two of those, like, that's really what I see myself as offering to this conversation. So with the question of slavery, there's this broad polemical attempt to try to flatten all kinds of historical slavery and make them the same thing, okay? And the slavery that emerges with capitalism is completely unlike anything that had ever existed in human history before. We just covered this material in my pre-colonial Africa survey class, is that Venetian merchants are experimenting with slave-stocked sugar plantations in the Mediterranean, in Crete and Malta and Cyprus in the 1330s and 1340s, using Greek, Bulgarian, Turkish, Slavic slaves. But they're using them in a way that they hadn't previously been used before, just for monocrop agriculture, not to grow anything that anyone would eat, just to grow sugar. And what they learn over the course of time is that if you allocate resources so that you're not actually concerned with like subsistence agriculture or feeding or sustaining populations of people, you're willing to just literally work them to death and replace them with entirely new crops of people every 3 or 4 years, then you can have incredibly high profits that you can then reinvest into doing the thing over and over and over again. Ultimately, those are the people that are financing Columbus's expeditions to the New World, and that complex jumps the Atlantic and modernity happens. But the slavery that emerges is completely unlike any slavery that had ever existed before, and it becomes targeted in a racialized way, specifically on Black bodies. With respect to race and racial understandings, and especially within Islam, this is one of the most common misconceptions. The majority of the Prophet's early followers, peace be upon him, were either dark-skinned Arabs, Africans, and or formerly enslaved or socially marginal people in Mecca. Now, this is a really complex statement that needs unpacking. The majority of the enslaved amongst the Arabs in the Prophet's time were Arabs, not Black people, okay? Secondly, Arabs knew Black people predominantly as conquerors.
I'm going to interrupt you. Can you say that again? Because even in my mind, this is what's so crazy about the world that we've grown up in. Even in my mind, right? When we read hadith, when we read stories of Quran about slavery, it's Black people in my mind.
No. The majority of the enslaved amongst the Arabs were Arabs, because they enslaved anybody that was politically marginal and weak that they could enslave in that point in time. And it was legal for them to enslave themselves for debt and for other reasons. So the vast majority of the enslaved amongst the Arabs were Arabs. The first time that Africans get introduced as enslaved populations in the Arabian Peninsula in any significant numbers is in the immediate aftermath of the failed conquest of the Kaaba that is recorded in Surah Al-Fil, about the Abyssinian armies being turned back in the year that the Prophet was born. Before that, the previous 200 years, Western Arabia was always under Ethiopian dominion. Africans ruled over the Arabs, and there were Arab slaves in Africa in that point in time. The dynamic was completely reversed. The first time that there's a fundamental shift in that is in the year that the Prophet himself is born. So now there are people who are descendants of those failed Abyssinian conquests in that year, and Bilal is among them. His mother is somebody who is taken prisoner in the aftermath of one of those battles, according to most of the narrations. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding. The majority of the enslaved amongst the Arabs were Arabs. And it's only essentially in that period that enslaved Black people are really introduced in any significant number at all, and almost always coming directly from this region of Abyssinia because of this one political conflict. And that's also the reason why the Prophet ﷺ sends his first community to Abyssinia. This is not just a Christian king that is known for nobility and goodness, but also the most powerful ruler in the region at the time. Period, full stop. It's the best place to get protection. There's much more that could be said about this. I worded my language very carefully when I said that they were either dark-skinned Arabs, Africans, or formerly enslaved or other socially marginal people, because those were sometimes overlapping categories, but not always. So if many of the enslaved are Arabs, many of them are not what we would describe as Black people. But the point is that many of the Arabs of that time are people that we would describe as Black people. right? So the Ali, the Prophet's own cousin, and the first male convert to Islam, is described in sources from the time as being asmar shadidul asmara in color, deep brown, chocolate brown in color. The color terminology that's used to describe Ali is the same color terminology that's used to describe Bilal. And Ali is a full-blooded Arab, not descended from intermarriage with Africans. And this shouldn't be surprising because the Arabs are descended from Abraham and Hagar. Hagar is of ancient Egyptian and therefore African origin. Arabs in that time ranged from bright in color, like the Prophet ﷺ, to very dark brown or even black in color. They later become whitened through the conquest of a bunch of Mediterranean societies that progressively lightens what Arabs look like. And you can track this plainly in like the emergence of light-skinned supremacy and Arab chauvinism in the medieval sources. So there is a kind of colorism that works its way into Islam, and there for sure is Arab ethnic chauvinism in early periods. But there's nothing like modern racism in those early Arabic sources. There's really nothing like it. And when we read history backwards and project essentially the dynamics of like 19th century Saudi Arabia, back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and imagine that all the Black people there are descendants of slaves, it's nonsensical. And we got Black people hiding in plain sight. Umar ibn al-Khattab, okay? The second caliph in Islam, the Prophet ﷺ's right-hand man, on his maternal grandmother's Abyssinian. Okay, so he's what we would think of today as a Black person, right? And you can be full-blooded Arab and be dark-skinned to begin with kinky hair, because Arab in that time is not a racial category. It's a cultural, linguistic, and genealogical category that has different kinds of people of color in it.
Oh, I got like 1,000 more questions, but Khadija, I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to my sister.
Sounds good. That was incredible, Jazakallah khair. Like I learned some, like that's not a lot of things that I would typically learn like at a lecture in a masjid and stuff like that. So may Allah reward you. But Sister Sada has a question, so I'll go ahead and ask. How does prison abolition fit into an Islamic framework? Considering the inherent harms and faults of the prison and criminal system, is it then Islamically obligatory to fight the system?
It's absolutely Islamically obligatory to fight the system. And I made an Instagram, post about this, just explaining it. I'll just explain what the post said, and then I'll explain how I, narrated it. So the post just said, in order to like get people to reflect on this, is that, I said Muslims pretend to be really concerned about bid'ah. But you know what didn't exist in the Prophet's time, peace be upon him? A formal police force. And then I said, y'all act like armed gangs with state authorization to kill. The idea for that came down the mountain with Moses. There is no formal police force in the Prophet's own time, okay? Nor is there state prison in the Prophet's own time. These are institutions that get introduced into Muslim practice in the Umayyad period. And as you know, if you've listened to me talk before, I don't claim anything that the Bani Umayyad did. They're the descendants of the people that tried to assassinate the Prophet. They're people that, that create essentially the Sunni Shiite divide in Islam. We don't have any reason to rubber stamp, militarized Arab chauvinistic conquest of the world in the name of the glory of Islam, which is how the conquests are usually narrated. So I don't claim, anything that they did as normative, certainly not the creation of police forces or prisons. So the point in all of that is to then, in the caption, I just spoke more specifically about this. And this is just a very simple premise, is that all of the legal scholars across time say al-asl huwa al-hurriya, the fundamental principle, the original state of humanity is freedom, period, full stop. And only very, very specific circumstances allow you to take a human being's freedom away from them. For most religious scholars, that was a jihad, a war to raise high the name of God that was mandated by a prophet who was given permission directly by God, or someone who was deputized by that prophet. In other words, that includes the prophet himself and any of the military activities of the first four caliphs and no one else. No one else has the right to take a human being's liberty. And Omar, who I mentioned before, took this very seriously. They used to say that he would set free any of the captives of the Persians who he found praying. And they said, "Oh, Commander of the Faithful, don't you know that they're doing that just to deceive you so that you'll set them free? They're just pretending to pray." And he said, better to be deceived by the one who deceives us in favor of God than to keep in bondage one who's praise to him. This was the character of, the people who surrounded the messenger of God when it came to understanding the centrality of human freedom to our enterprise as Muslims. So you can't take people's freedom without very specific circumstances, and you certainly can't take their lives without very specific circumstances. Who authorized these people to kill in our name? Who authorized these people to kill in our name? We sit here and have discussions about whether bank interest is riba or not. We have conversations about whether Skittles have gelatin and whether we walk with our right foot when we go into a house or to a mosque. And we're not asking whether the money that we pay in taxes is being used to murder our fellow citizens. We treat that as though it's not an Islamic concern. It is a testament to the utter moral poverty of this community and its complete and total complicity with capitalist values. It is an abomination before God, and I'll say it to anybody who wants to hear it.
Allahu Akbar. You see, was anybody asking why we invited Dr. Bilal Ware? I think if anything, they were asking why we didn't invite you to speak every week. But alhamdulillah, Sheikh. First let me go ahead, following up on the question of abolition and,
Sure.
and incarceration. I wanted to give a quick shout out to Brother Yusuf Wiley out there, who's one of the brothers who I might have only met him once or twice in person, but been following him on social media and stuff, and a brother who formerly incarcerated, got out, and has been really pushing for liberation and putting that hard work in. And so he's joining us today, and I wanted to give a special shout out to him as well. There's so many good questions in the Q&A, and I want to be cognizant of your time, Dr. Ware.
We can take another couple minutes. I'm good. Look, I had my 4 shots of espresso with my sahur, so we can.
All
do
right, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask a question. His name's popping up as Amos Williams on here, but I know him as my brother Ice B, or Abdul Aziz, who's also a part of the hip hop world and a group called The Wrong Kind here in San Diego. And so I wanted to make sure that I got to his question. It's a simple question. Why don't we know about any of this?
Yeah, and I saw also in the chat, he said, is there a class we can send our kids to learn this? So the answer so I'll answer the is there a class? I started a curriculum last year called Invisible Muslims, Black People in the Sacred Story of Islam. And we had over 1,000 people participate in the curriculum from different, mosques and community centers and Islamic schools around the country. Also just, private citizens purchasing it for their household. I started literally like a company called Ink of the Scholars, in order to like facilitate like getting access to this knowledge into our communities. Because like, why should the white kids at UCSB and Latin kids, it's one of the things I like about teaching at UCSB is that it's a very, very Latin serving institution. But why should the kids that are paying tuition or their parents be the only ones that get access to this kind of knowledge? Like, we need to put it at the disposition of our community. So Invisible Muslims, and we're planning to offer it again this coming fall for sure. So like, you know, sign up. And we did fundraising so that like, especially, you know, inner city mosques and Muslim schools, that we like do fundraising so that we can get all of their costs covered or most of their costs covered. So that it becomes something that's very easy and affordable for everybody to get to access to these links. And it's literally, you know, a series of courses like Africa in the Quran, right? Like, people don't know that most of the Qisas al-Anbiya, most of the tales of the prophets that are in the Quran take place in Africa. Think about it. Most of it's in ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians, I teach African history. Every practicing Africanist historians will tell you that Egyptian civilization emerges from inner African origins, and that the ancient Egyptians were blacker than the ace of spades. That's not a thing that's debated anymore, right? So, and most of the tales of the prophets in the Quran take place in ancient Egypt or around ancient Egypt. So the majority of those tales of the prophet actually take place in Africa. Then one on the Black companions, then one on Muslim scholars of Africa, where we talk about these genealogies of freedom struggles being rooted literally in 500 years of African history. And then the last one is on the African Islam in African America, Islam in the Black community in the diaspora, you know, broadly conceived. So including Brazil and the Caribbean, but with a special focus on the US. So like, there's a whole curriculum, not just myself, but like other instructors with both PhDs and or classical, you know, Islamic, you know, education. So that's one. Like, you can definitely send your kids to learn that. And we're literally working on the materials for, you know, promoting the course for this coming fall right now. As to why we don't know it, you know, you said that our brothers, you know, a brother from the hip hop community, you and I talk as much about hip hop as we talk about anything else, Khalid. So I'll just say, like, you know, knowledge of self, you know, the powers that be want us ignorant of who we really are and where we really come from, because we are easily manipulable when we don't know where we come from. This legacy is by definition dangerous to them. And it's as dangerous to them in our time as it was in Douglas's time, as it was in the time of that man on that Savannah dock, as dangerous as it was to slave traders in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s when Abdul Qadir Khan is coming to power. Anytime Black people mobilize the moral and ethical traditions of our ancestors in order to struggle in a systematic fashion for human liberation, we free all of humanity with us. All of humanity with us. And that's what people were responding to after the Floyd murder. People understood in a basic way in every corner of this world that if we could get Black people free in this moment, that somehow everybody was going to get free. Because you can't cut off all of the tentacles of white supremacy and racial capitalism. They govern everything in every society now. But if you stab at the belly of the beast, if you stab the monster in its heart, then all the tentacles are going to fall away. If Black people ever truly become free in these United States of America, it is a harbinger for the liberation of humanity as a whole.
MashaAllah. Sister Khadija, you up next. There's a lot of, I know you probably have your own questions. There's also a lot of questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, I know a lot of folks are aching to have their question answered, so I'll just go ahead and ask. This one's more about your book. Can you share what the research process was like for your book, The Walking Quran?
Yeah, it came out of my PhD dissertation. So I did a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. And I was researching the history of Quran schooling in Senegal, and that's what I wrote my PhD on. When I finished that dissertation, I wanted to expand it into something that wasn't just about Senegal and wasn't just about the last 200 years, which was really what my dissertation was about. So then I undertook additional research to really span about 1,000 years of history and to really cover West Africa in a more comprehensive way. So really, I take in materials from, Senegal all the way through Nigeria, and over the last 1,000 years to try to like create a comprehensive picture of like, not only the practices of Islamic knowledge transmission, but how they're rooted in very specific kinds of social struggles in the African tradition. There's a lot that we can learn from African modalities of teaching and spreading Islam, like for what in part, like just a simple thing, right? From chapter 2. So I talked in a critical way about the Arab conquest, and I don't call what Bani Umayyah did Muslim conquest at all, because there ain't nothing Islamic about most of it at all. It's Arab conquest. But that doesn't extend into sub-Saharan Africa. There is no external conquering force that spreads Islam to sub-Saharan Africa. So instead, Islam spreads voluntarily when indigenous African lineages adopt the teaching of Islam as their vocation. And they do the work of spreading. It's literally the jihad of those wooden boards that I showed on the slide, as opposed to the jihad of the sword. And so they developed like a modality of teaching and an ecumenical approach to tolerance, of always working in peaceable fashion with non-Muslim authorities. And over the course of time, they turned, places that had no Muslims into places that have nothing but Muslims. And so my own kind of approach to the way that we expand the moral sway of Islam in the United States of America is really derived from the lessons that I learned for how they were effective in establishing Islam in the land of our ancestors. And so that had to do with, they never took up arms until the slave trade became something that they had to take up arms to fight against. But before that, literally in every instance, they're always focusing on providing benefit to the children of Adam, focusing on education rather than proselytizing. There's a very like kind of specific, approach. So that's what I would say in response to the question.
Jazakallah khair. And I'll point out the class Invisible Muslims. I think that was like the first time that I took that class and learned about a lot of these things. And so while there were kids on there, there were also a lot of adults. So don't think of this only as a curriculum for your children or for schools, because I was able to benefit a lot from it. And the thing that occurred to me most, when we become Muslim, often one of the things that attracts us to Islam and the first things that we embrace as Black American Muslims the most is decolonizing our construct of God and of Allah. So going from, when you say God, imagining a dude that just stepped off of Huntington Beach or UC Santa Barbara, and or the Santa Claus figure, the old wise man sitting with the big beard. And one of the things that's most attractive is how
white man in the sky like Zeus.
How Allah is bigger than that. You can't imagine Allah. But it occurred to me while taking that class that while I had kind of deconstructed, decolonized my image or my perception of Allah, of God, I hadn't decolonized everything else. So, for example, when I thought of Musa alayhi salam, I still thought of Charles Heston, right?
Yep, Charles Heston.
Those are still the images that were in my mind, and so listening about that. So my new thing is combining my questions with some of the brilliant questions that are coming in the Q&A. So one of my good friends and one of the first supporters of Pillars of the Community, who's actually in the Emirates watching with us right now, Dr. Adam Jeffers, has a question in here. That he enjoyed the book and wanted you to expand on the meaning in the book where you talk about, quote, emulate the Blacks or look after the Blacks, being traced to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may peace be upon him. Yes. And what I'll add to that is, man, you got to break down the story of Musa a little bit
I will. Okay.
Just give us a little bit of a taste.
I'll give you a taste. So we'll go in reverse order. So we'll start with you said Dr. Jeffers' question. So I mentioned that each chapter of the Walking Quran has a hadith to frame it. I don't actually say that in the book. What I say in the book is a saying attributed to the Prophet, because in point of fact, there are two that I use that I can't be sure are actually verifiable hadith. One is the ink of the scholar is better than the blood of the martyr, which frames chapter 2 and is sometimes circulated as a hadith, but I'm almost certain that Hassan al-Basri was the first person to say it. And the other is the one that Dr. Jeffers points to, which is that sometimes the chain of transmission for Ittihada as-Sudan, which I translate as emulate the blacks, is the chain of transmission is questioned whether the Prophet actually said this or not. So just first, a kind of philosophical / semantic point is that sometimes people will say that's a weak hadith, okay? Don't ever say that it's a weak hadith. Say that it has a chain that's in dispute, or if you want to say it has a weak chain, then you can say so. But you don't know if the Prophet said it, and nothing that the Prophet ever said was weak. So don't ever call a thing a weak hadith. There's no such thing. There's hadith that have weak chains of transmission or that can't necessarily be verified. Now, as for this one, I actually think that this is most likely an authentic narration. And I first encountered it in the context of its mistranslation. It was being translated as look after the blacks, instead of what it plainly means in most of the times that ittihadu is used in Quran and in other sources, which is literally to take after someone. And if from the context, which is the context of the hadith is to say, take after the blacks, for from among them are 3 lords of the people of paradise. The Negus of Abyssinia, in other words, that Christian king that I mentioned that gave safe harbor to the Muslims, Luqman the sage, who has an entire chapter of the Quran in his name, and Bilal the Muezzin, the first to call to Islam. So the question that I asked with respect to this is, even if you wanted to have a paternalistic interpretation, like look after the blacks, it doesn't even fit with the meaning of the hadith. Look after the blacks because from among them are 3 lords of the people of paradise. You just described 3 powerful, wise people. Why would you be talking about you then have to look after them? The Prophet ﷺ was saying, emulate the blacks, for from among them are 3 lords of the people of paradise. And that was, plainly the case, because there isn't anything in authentic narrations from him, ﷺ, that ever showed condescension or paternalism towards Black people. Again, they were a principal part of his early following and his exemplars. And here's how I'll connect it to your question, Khalid. The Prophet ﷺ said that when he saw visions of Moses, and he had many visions of Moses, he said that he was the most handsome of the Black men. He described him as Adam Shadidul Udma, which is dark black in color, or Asmar Shadidul Asmar, dark brown in color. He said his hair was Ja'ad, kinky or nappy. That's how he described Moses. And Moses is the most frequently occurring proper name in the Quranic text, occurring at least 135 times. Aisha, who we mentioned before, is describing the Prophet, peace be upon him, as the Quran walking upon the earth. She has a narration that she said the stomach of the messenger of God was never full. And if he didn't have anything to break his fast, it didn't stop him from going out and fasting again the next day. She said, I used to weep for him for the condition that I found him in and say, you are a messenger of God. Why not ask your Lord for at least enough to fill your stomach? And he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, Aisha, what do I have to do with this world of yours? My brothers amongst the resolute messengers were patient and steadfast in the face of worse than this. I would be ashamed to go back to my Lord and rejoin their company, having enjoyed a life of ease and comfort. So why am I telling that story now? Is that the majority of those prophets that the Prophet ﷺ was emulating were Black people. including and especially Moses, who's the most frequently occurring name in the book that he, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, bore on his heart. They were his heroes. They were the people that he looked up to. He saw himself, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, as walking in Moses' footsteps when he made his hijrah. That was his exodus. So our entire, what's the word I'm looking for? Worldview on Islam, just as you said, brother, has been colonized. It has been thoroughly riddled with Arab ethnic chauvinism that causes Black people in the sacred story, whether in the Quran or in the life of the Prophet or in our Islamic history more broadly, to disappear. And the argument that I make about that is that Black people are so fundamental to the Quranic text and to the early source material and to the history of religion that this is not ignorance. This is willed ignorance. This is not people just being forgotten. This is Black folks being made to disappear.
Jazakallah khair. Khalid, do you want to say something first?
It's you?
Okay, cool. So actually, I have a question, and I guess I'll put a question in a question like Brother Khalid. So many times, especially as a Black Muslim woman, there's a lot of cultural aspects that are thrown into the greater general Islam, where Muslim women should be like subservient or sit to the back, especially as an activist and a community organizer, completely overlooked or completely overshadowed by other folks, and especially folks who are non-Black. So can you just basically talk about the specifically the role of Muslim women and then Black Muslim women?
Okay, so yes, and thank you for this. So I'll just open my reflections on this with a saying of, since we were talking about Moses, I'm going to bring Pharaoh now into the story. So Rabi al-Adawiya, the great saint and scholar from Basra, she used to say, God bless the women, God bless the women, God bless the women. For none of the women has ever been guilty of, none of the women has ever claimed what Pharaoh claimed. Now, what is she saying? Pharaoh's claim, remember, he says, I know for you no other God than me. In other words, there is no God except for me. I am the only object worthy of worship, is what Pharaoh said. So Rabia, no woman has ever claimed what Pharaoh claimed. And if the men don't claim it with their tongues, then they say it in their hearts and with their deeds. The truth is that men walk around in this community haughty, as though they're objects to be worshiped on earth, idols to be deified and followed. And it is the principal obstacle, even above racism, to the effective expansion of genuine Islamic ethics in the society. Because God himself forbids any good from coming into anything that we do when we abuse the bearers of the womb. If you cut off the rahm, the womb, then you cut off the rahmah, the mercy. Period, full stop. And I tell this to, especially to the Desi and Arab brothers whose cultures are fundamentally misogynistic and rotten to the root and the core. They are built on the oppression of women, the idea that women should be neither seen nor heard. And Islamic education in West Africa was always coeducational in times that women were being forbidden to read in other parts of the Muslim world. If you go to those foundational clerical families in West Africa, the Jahanke, because men are required to ritually lead the prayer in mixed congregations, the women make the supplication after the prayer in order to keep balance between the male and female principles in devotional activity. Black women have never been willing to sit through that kind of misogynistic nonsense, and our cultural imitation of people who abuse their women has stifled women within our own community. Shame on us. Shame on us, shame on us, shame on us. And no good will come to our community as long as we treat our women this way. And it is not in our custom as Black people. Listen, the Prophet ﷺ, the best in creation, was sent to the Arabs because they were the worst of people in their time. They were burying their daughters alive, and as soon as he was gone, they went right back to burying them. Culturally, stifling them, silencing them. That was not his sunnah. He was the most gentle towards women, always kind, always tolerant, always listening, always good. And he said that the judgment of you in your goodness will be in how you treat women. And I'll just say this about the Invisible Muslims curriculum, and it's for that reason that we developed the curriculum as always being team taught by 2 instructors for each course, 1 male and 1 female, so that we could model. I'm in a mood, so I'm not going to say what's on my mind, so that we could model for these people what healthy gender relations are supposed to look like when, men actually respect women as exemplars of knowledge and piety, rather than people that are supposed to be cooking and picking up after them. Because where in the Quran does it say that a woman is supposed to be cooking and cleaning for you? Where in the Sunnah? Show me, point to it. These are cultural norms that were established by misogynistic people, and we have no reason to follow them.
SubhanAllah, Jazakumullah khair. So I'm going to follow up on that with a couple of questions. One of them is that it occurred to me as you're speaking, there's a couple of things. One is, I'm going to try to combine them so that, because otherwise we're going to keep you here, Sheikh, till Maghrib, till it's time to break fast, honestly. So one of the things that I noticed kind of early on in Islam, and at first it seemed like a weakness, but as I've grown as Muslim, I've embraced it actually as one of the strengths of Islam, that no region, no part of the Muslim world has ever had a monopoly on Islam, right? So at first I was like, how's the Center of Islamic Studies going to go from Mecca to Iraq, modern day Iraq, to Africa, to Spain, to here, to there, and everything like that. And so
in the Timbuktu in the 1350s and 1400s, absolutely, yep.
And that's actually reflected in scholarship that you read from all over the Muslim world, right? Because I was given the impression at first that if it's not coming from Saudi, it's not legit.
Right.
Which doesn't mean that there's not a lot of legit stuff that comes from Saudi. But then all of a sudden, when I started, I had an opportunity to live in Syria for a while. And so I would hear the scholars talking in the masajids, and they would be quoting African scholars. They would be quoting Indian scholars with like the utmost respect. And then you would go to the Islamic bookstores over there were kind of like mind blowing. It's like art. And you would see volumes and volumes written from Indian scholars. You would see volumes and volumes and volumes of books written by African scholars, all in Arabic. And that kind of, this is my tie-in. In the beginning, you were talking about literacy and the literacy in Africa, but also.
Uh-oh.
Khalid, I don't know.
I really wanted to hear where the question was going. Like he set it up and everything, on the literacy piece. But maybe we can get Khalid back sooner rather than later. Do we want to do another one while we're waiting for him to come back and finish his question?
Yes, so this one's like a statement and a question. So Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz was assisted by an African-American who many in older generations of our Ummah were introduced to our folks' connection to Islam and their Western roots. Alex Haley. Maybe Haley, although a capitalist, was a 20th century abolitionist for modern forms of slave mentality. What are your thoughts?
Okay. Yes. So, and this is crucial, because it's also a place where, as Black Muslims, our following. So we're on another one, Khaled. We'll let you finish your question while I answer the question that Haroon asked in the chat. So one of the first things that we need to do as Black Muslims is to repair the damage that we have done to our own community's unity as Black people. One of the things that has come in the last 20 to 30 years is that we have essentially abdicated positions of leadership within the Black community through our slavish imitation of imported cultural norms. Okay. We have pronounced ourselves as basically irrelevant to the broader Black struggle, compared to how Malcolm comported himself as somebody that was at the forefront of Black struggle. And we've done this because we've become people who are more concerned about the length of our beards and the shortness of our pants, or whether our hijab is over our head, than whether we're stopping Black people from getting murdered in the streets. We've taken on external valuations of our culture that have been foisted upon us by people who sometimes actually hate us, who will tell us that our music is haram while they're listening to Fairuz, okay, and other Middle Eastern singers. And because of that, when we were the origins of hip hop music as Black Muslims, we abandoned it and stopped threading the emancipatory, political, and social and spiritual messages into the music. 5%ers have brought more people to Islam than we have as Orthodox Muslim proselytizers. 5% of rappers have produced more converts than we have as so-called Orthodox Muslims. So the point here in responding to the question is that we have to heal our relationship with the broader Black community. And that like, look, I'll just be honest, that's why I love my brother Khaled, like, you know, because like some of us understand that there is no way to actually make our Islam stand up unless we are standing with our brothers and sisters of color in the struggle, whatever their religious affiliation. And that was also the standpoint of the Jahanke scholars, right, that spread Islam in West Africa, is that they were from the communities and they expressed Islam in local languages, in local cultural idioms, and they were providing benefit and service to their brothers and sisters. And it was their benefit and service and social work that produced the converts, not the looking down your nose at people and saying, how come you don't pray like I pray or act like I act? That produces exactly zero converts, exactly zero. So healing that and understanding that like real Black liberation theology is, I'm gonna use an academic word, but it's an ontological approach that is threaded through multiple African metaphysical systems. In other words, Black liberation theology is an approach to being that is found in many different creeds. It has been expressed through African traditional religions. It has been expressed through Black Christianity. It has been expressed through seemingly secular Black social organization. All of those things are rooted in Black liberation theology. But we as Muslims have this extraordinary capacity to bring the clearest, most authentic articulation of the relationship between spirituality as a vertical connection with the divine presence and social justice as the way of establishing khilafa, real stewardship in creation. We are armed with the best repertory to contribute to this discussion, and we are abdicating our responsibility. We have not just the ideas and ethics of Islam, but we also have a history of 500 years of struggling against racist, white supremacist, capitalist modernity. And yet we go in unarmed, right? We have all of these resources at our disposal. And, somebody, convinced us that either social justice work doesn't have anything to do with our Islam, or our Islam doesn't have anything to do with social justice work.
I was mad. I thought everybody logged off while I was asking the question, and turned out it was me that somehow got logged off. I'm not really sure how. I can't not follow up on everything that you say, as hard as I try. But not only have we given up our agency as Muslims, because one of the things I love the most about Black American Muslims is we learn and take from the best of so many different cultures, right? So we're able to study in other countries. We're able to, just look at what I call Sunnah swag. You got some brothers, right, that'll be rocking some cut off jeans with a long Arab style thobe. You got another brother that'll rock a lungi with a shirt that's making sure that his muscles are popping, right? And add our own spice, right, to the Sunnah swag. And we see that as far as the deen too, where we're able to learn from African scholars, from Arab scholars, and everything like that. But a lot of the time, those of us who haven't had the opportunity to travel, and this is connecting to that idea of, the center of Islam has always moved, that we often, not only do we take the version of immigrant Islam that has come to us, but we also don't recognize that many immigrants, and may Allah reward, like some of them have done amazing work.
Yep.
And so I don't want to take away from that. But they weren't religious in their countries, which many of them were not religious in their countries, and did not make the migration out of a sense of duty to religion, but actually found religion once they were here, and never had the opportunity to actually sit and learn from actual scholars. Because when you go to and sit with scholars in India, when you sit with scholars in Africa, when you sit with scholars in the Arab world, overwhelming majority of them aren't talking about these small differences of how I pray and how I do this and how I dress. Like when they're dealing with fiqh and when they're dealing with issues, it's these larger issues. Having said that, back to the question before I was cut off, literacy in Islam. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of literacy, about the importance of reading, about the importance of engaging in these traditions and learning about them on our own and by ourselves and sitting with others, like in Islam and in our resistance to in our attempts to decolonize, and the importance of literacy and reading?
Yeah. So for me, this is the most fundamental intervention of my first book of the Walking Quran, is actually in the way that it tries to reorient our approach to knowing, and have it be something that conforms more with both original Islamic practice and with African traditions of knowledge transmission. And those are really the same thing, that knowing in our traditions, both the African and the Islamic, and of course, those that are both African and Islamic, are rooted in experiential embodied transmission of knowledge. Analytical knowledge separated from ontology, separated from one's being, is a fiction that is invented by Europeans in their âge de lumière, in the Enlightenment. Okay, they come up with this absurd idea, and I know I'm going to make some people mad with this, but this absurd idea of the mind. Okay, so I just want to point this out. The Quran never mentions the mind, not one time. There's not a single reference in the Quran or any authentic hadith to aql as a noun, meaning the intellect or the mind. There's aqala as a verb, but the thing that does the intellection in the Quran and in the hadith is always the heart. The heart. And the heart is also the center of ancient Egyptian metaphysics. It's the core of inspiration, emotion, knowledge. It's the primary site of action in most African traditional religious systems as well, because the heart is the core of the human being, and it is the organ which connects the metaphysical realm, the unseen, to the physical realm of the seen. So traditional African knowledge practices are designed to utilize the totality of a human being. Education through the limbs, the heart, the spirit, and the soul, educate the totality of a person. And that comes with sitting at the feet of scholars. It comes with learning how to do things without talking about them, just through mimesis, through copying the motions, through spending. So for example, my father, people that knew him well will tell you that my voice sounds like his, and my hand gestures and mannerisms are like his, in spite of the fact that, I didn't live with him as like a primary residence after I was about 7 years old. Okay. But the reason for that is that you learn most of what you're going to learn not through anybody directly teaching you that thing, but just simply by being around people. And as you learn to be in the world, your examples of how to be in the world are garnered from those that are socializing you. So the point of this is that we need to start to understand transmission of Islam as an ethical system, as a comportment, as a means of establishing a metaphysical connection through the tried and true knowledge transmission practices of our ancestors, which is less of a focus on situating literacy in a narrow analytical and discursive frame as this tool that we need to acquire for job acquisition and other things, but rather as part of a broader socialization of human beings and as a tool of liberation, because that's what it was being used for by our African Muslim ancestors. And that's also what it was being used for in the community of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina. That's what education is for. It's for making people into people and teaching them how to free themselves. And we have lots of examples of that in our tradition. And again, like my fundamental complaint, like, Malcolm says, like, if a cat has kittens in an oven, you don't call them biscuits. We've cut ourselves off from the roots of, of what made us us. And I want to say one other part of this. That swag, that Sunnah swag that you talked about, and that eclectic approach, like hip hop expresses that as well, right? You can take music that comes from any part of the world, but if you get the beat break right, then you can make it into hip hop. This is something that is hardwired into Black culture in the Americas specifically, okay? And there's a reason for this, is that when people like that enslaved man on that Savannah dock and others were being brought from literally hundreds of different linguistic communities, hundreds of different cultural backgrounds, and put to work under the brutalizing conditions of American slavery, they had to produce a common grammar for a culture that couldn't be united just through ancestral practices anymore, because everybody had different ancestral practices. So they labored to find not the vocabulary of a shared experience. In other words, not the exact same words, but to establish a common grammar across Black culture that a lot of different kinds of speech acts could find themselves situated in. So we can remix anything and make it Black, because that's how we became Black, out of being thousands of different kinds of African identities. Blackness in America is a miracle, because never before in human history had hundreds of different cultures had their peoples enslaved, brought into an entirely new context, united by nothing other than a racial slur that is subjected against them by the population. And they turned that around and turned it into a positive identity driven by an authentic liberatory humanism. When we renounce Blackness, it's an affront to God. He brought us through this experience so that we could teach the world a timeless truth through our experience about how to become one people without having what made you vanish. And I'll say the last part about this to because I agree with you. I sometimes come across as hard on, immigrants. We both know that it's not all immigrant Muslims, right? But the younger generation, especially, are often attracted to our culture, not just because like our culture is youth culture for the world, but also because I suspect that they just have this instinctive understanding that if they want to stay them, they have to learn the magic from us. Because as you said, like everybody else that is colonized by Europeans either becomes Europeans or they become a mirror opposite of Europeans. Like that over identification with Islam in a narrow kind of identity driven way by immigrants here is out of a fear of being just made into to white people, right? But they become white people in every significant way: class, privilege, racial condescension, all of those things. The point is that we've been in the belly of the beast for 400 plus years, and we're still us, and that's a miracle. If we abdicate that, we're going to be held accountable before God for it.
It's jazz, right? It's our ability to take something and riff on it and make it ours, and it can take noise and sound and make it beautiful, and take the scraps and turn it into a meal. And honestly, it's everything that makes me proud to be an American.
Yep.
Is the resistance to what it means to be American. I like to say as American as bean pie and chai, right? Yep. We're not dealing with apple pie. We're not dealing with all of that. We're taking it all, man. And
I'll take some peach cobbler.
Right.
So let those
for some reason, these talks during Ramadan always turn to food, and we actually rapped yesterday talking about bean pies as well. One of my favorite words in the world actually is AWK, ak. And it's because it's not akhi, it's not my brother, that's my ak. And there's something about that and about the Americanization of that word. Like I won't say akhi. If I'm speaking in Arabic with somebody or whatever, I'll say it.
Nah, I ain't going out like that.
But the word ak itself is beautiful. And to me, I always struggle with the concept between practicing Islam and establishing it. And I don't think there's any word that I know of more that signifies the beginning of establishing Islam in this country as the word ak. Ak. I'm gonna let you, take us out. We spent longer today than normal, but I can't say how blessed I feel to be able to be in conversation with you, with our sister Khadija, and all of those tuning in. So I'm gonna hand it over to you, folks. Next weekend, tune back in. We have another couple of amazing speakers that are going to be joining us, and so Dr. Bilal Ware.
Okay, well, I'm gonna then pass the mic because I mentioned the Jahanke principle of having the women make the supplication after the prayer. And the one thing that I would add to your beautiful reflection is that, yes, we have established, ak, but we haven't established, akht yet. Like we haven't made the sisters you know, like the sisters vernacular expression of women's, you know, Muslim women's Black sisterhood. Like that's the thing that we need to get to if we're really going to make Islam stand up. So I'm with you 100,000%, as you know, but I'm going to ask our sister Khadija to make the closing supplication, inshallah.
Okay, cool, I got you. All right, Bismillah. Ya Allah, you are the most merciful, passionate, forgiving. Please reward Dr. Bilal and everyone involved in the planning of these programs. Please bless each and everyone who attended and their families, and protect them from the evils of this world and grant them Jannat al-Firdaus. Ya Allah, you are the most hearing, you are the all-seeing. You hear what we cannot physically say, and you see the internal battles that we are facing while others do not. Please grant us ease to all of our hearts, guide our hearts to only you, to the remembrance of you. Make our hearts and our bodies yearn for your love, your words, your remembrance. Allow us to take everything we learned in today's program and implement it into our lives. Ya Allah, for all of our Muslim brothers and sisters suffering around the world, please remove oppressive regimes, governments, and grant them justice and bring ease to their pain. For those facing the horrid attacks of police brutality, please grant them justice and bring justice to their families and communities. And allow us to plant the seed of hope through fighting injustices and oppression in our communities. Ya Allah, please protect the Muslims and their families, and bring justice to those in the prison industrial complex. Please protect the families who are being separated. Please protect and bless our siblings in Yemen who are being starved, our siblings in Ethiopia, Myanmar, China, France, and everywhere else where they believe are facing the effects of hatred. And please reward them for all of their struggles, grant them patience and justice, and allow us to all meet in Jannah. Ya Allah, unite our hearts, mend our ties, guide us to the pathways of peace, deliver us from darkness to light, save us from hidden and apparent indecencies, and bless our ears, our eyes, our hearts, our friends, our families, and accept our repentance, as you are the one who guides the most, who guides to repentance and accepts it, the most merciful. Alternative hearts, make our hearts steadfast in your deen. Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala dinik. والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. آمين.
Nah, see that right there is a mic drop. So alhamdulillah.
On that note, folks, follow Dr. Bilal Ware at Butch Ware, I believe, on Instagram. He's always posting important conversations and classes that you can be a part of. We also have some folks, and maybe you can put it in the chat, who are in the different UC systems that are interested in figuring out a way to take some of your courses at UC Santa Barbara in some shape or form. And so I don't know the specific name of your class. Everybody else, we have, again, next Saturday and Sunday, tell your friends, tell your family, come back. Make sure after you're done that you go and make a couple extra rakats, salatul ishraq. Nothing but rewards in this right here. So alhamdulillah, listening to this and listening to, you know, the word of Allah and a calling towards deen is nothing but blessings. Let's cap off them blessings with an extra 2 rakats and then go about our day. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.